Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate the build up as well. Do you mind jumping to the next slide? So as everyone knows by now, my name is Bill Olson. I'm Executive Security Advisor at AWS. What that means in my role is I get to help my customers with any of their security and or compliance related challenges. And my customers are in what we call our public sector. So I get to work with all levels of the government, healthcare, education, some nonprofits like our pension funds. So I get the opportunity to work with very mature organizations just starting out, and everything in between. So I thought for the time I have here, I was going to break it up into these three chunks here, primarily to give you some context about what the cloud is, what AWS offers, and some insight into where and how some of the areas of cybersecurity come up. So cloud fundamentals, that's primarily going to be that context I mentioned about what AWS is, what we offer, and along with a couple concepts that are going to be really important to understand as you start delving into the cloud. Uh, Second section, security fundamentals. This is primarily some of the strategy behind what referred to as a security program. So what does an organization need to do to protect their information and assets? And then third is we'll take a look at a couple of our security specific services that we offer here at AWS. And you can look at that in two lights. One as tools that you can potentially use in an organization to keep it secure. And on the flip side, these are the type of tools that can be developed. So if you kind of go more the engineering route, these are the kind of things to create to help people protect their organization. Do you mind jump to next slide? Actually, you can go to the next one right away too. So we'll start with these fundamentals. So the first is just what is AWS? So Amazon Web Services, you can probably guess by the name, it came out of Amazon, the e-commerce giant. And AWS was launched around 2006, and it started with the idea that what Amazon was doing to support the massive e-commerce operation that was in place could also be helpful to others. So fast forward to today, AWS, we have what we think is the world's most comprehensive and broadly adopted cloud. So we offer 200 of what we call services. These are basically different tools you can use to accomplish whatever your business requirements are. That's from building applications, security services to help protect those. I mean, now generative AI services, quantum computing services. So it's very easy to turn on any and all of these right away. And the AWS infrastructure, what you're seeing on the screen there, is basically a giant global network of servers that allow us to offer this on-demand operations like the compute power, database storage, content delivery, as well as other services. And one of the things people don't typically understand right away is that massive interconnected backbone there. We have services that allow our customers to connect directly to our network so that they don't actually have to have their traffic pass through the public internet. They can keep it private for security. Go to the next slide. So one of the important things, whomever you're working with, is to understand the terminology we use. So for AWS, some of the terminology that goes in that infrastructure is highlighted on the screen here. So we have the concept of a region, which is basically just a physical location somewhere in the world. And so availabilities, for example, our region outside of Montreal that we call Canada East, that has 3 availability zones. And each of those availability zones consists of one or more discrete data centers. So each of those would have redundant power, networking, connectivity, all housed in separate facilities. So that would be one region would have, in the order of potentially a dozen data centers. And it's important to understand that terminology, that general understanding of the infrastructure, but also in the context of disaster recovery and resiliency. So we find most of our customers can meet their disaster requirement or resiliency objectives with one region. If you want to dive into that a bit more, if you do a search for AWS Goldilocks, as in Goldilocks and the Three Bears, there's a great blog out there that goes into more detail about how we decide where to place our infrastructure to have that balance between environmental impact, like hurricanes, ice storms, that kind of thing, versus the speed of light and latency to support high availability, high scalability applications. You go to the next slide.
Sure.
And we do actually have a second region coming to Canada. This is going to be out west, outside of Calgary. So this is great for customers or people that have a user base out west, or spread across Canada, or if they have more intense disaster recovery requirements. But it's also, I like to share this slide because those numbers on the screen, you can see the level of or scale of resources that go into one of these regions. So that's from the data center infrastructure itself to the people involved, as well as investing in renewable energy sources like solar farms. So there's enough resources pouring into projects like this that it's actually going to affect Canada's GDP. You can go to the next slide. And stats on this slide just kind of give you some highlights of why some organizations choose AWS. One of the our driving principles is being customer obsessed. So middle row on the right, that improved TCO, that highlights that as AWS is able to refine and improve what we do, we can pass that efficiency on to our customers. So since AWS launch, we've reduced the cost of our services over 100 times. And then it was noted on the previous slide that we invest in things like solar farms. So we're also focused on sustainability. So at this point, our Canada regions are powered almost entirely by renewable hydro or solar power. And then bottom right, that 4,500 number, I'll touch on that later in the slide too, but we also have a huge ecosystem of partners and marketplace offerings. So while we offer AWS, quote unquote, native services, if there's a tool or a firm that you are familiar with or prefer working with or meets your requirements better, you can certainly run those on AWS. Next slide, please. So likely the most important cloud fundamental to understand is what we refer to as a shared responsibility model. At a very high level, that's AWS has things that they'll take care of, and the customers have some responsibilities. And we characterize that as AWS takes care of the security of the cloud. That's the physical infrastructure, the facilities, the compute, the actual building blocks. And customers take care of security in the cloud. So that would mean you secure your workloads and applications that you deploy onto a cloud. So car analogy tends to be a good way to understand that. So in that analogy, using AWS would be a bit like driving a car. So you don't actually have to know how the engine works or how the air conditioning keeps you cool. All you need is the skill to drive that car and control the basic features of the vehicle. Now, if you decide to leave that car with the doors open overnight in a busy area, you're not necessarily holding up your end of responsibility. So your responsibility is going to be primarily driven by what cloud services you select, which in turn determines the amount of configuration work you're going to have to do to secure your applications. If you go to the next slide. Which brings up an important point within that is that that line of responsibility isn't static. You've got some choice in where that line of responsibility falls. So the more cloud native services that you use, the more that line of responsibility is going to shift to AWS. And in the security world, that element of choice is going to be important. So whether you're in an organization that has a good sense of what they're doing security wise or it's brand new, there's going to be some level of understanding of what you are doing, what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, what you'd like to get better at. And so as you decide to shift applications of workload into the cloud, you can apply that knowledge to try to make some better choices. Like, is your organization good at keeping up with patching, or would you rather shift some of that to AWS? Those kind of choices help drive the conversation and keep security in the mix and at the forefront of the organization's decision making. We go to the next slide. And so as we're going to delve more into security, one of the primary elements is trust, particularly in the context of how do I verify? And so AWS tries to do that in primarily three ways with our customers. So one is just contracts. It's a legal agreement between that states what we're going to provide and what the customer can expect. The second is technical controls, which we'll dive into more in a bit. But basically, these are tools that we offer our clients so they can help meet their requirements. And the third is what we call third-party validations. And these are independent assessments that customers can use to confirm that AWS is doing what we're saying we're doing. So if you go to the next slide. So on that third point, we support more security standards and compliance certifications than I think most of the offerings at this point. So I think the number is up at about 143 security standards and various compliance certifications, a few of which are on the screen there. And these include standards related to credit cards, payments like PCI, healthcare like HIPAA, high tech, government specific ones for working with like defense contractors, that kind of thing, like FedRAMPs. privacy, GDPR, and other standards like encryption module standards. There's a whole range of FIPS as well as just common security standards like the NIST 800, 171, and those kind of flavors. So we go to the next slide. And besides helping our customers verify that AWS is doing what we're saying, customers can also leverage those security standards to support their activities. So using that illustration on this slide, you can see they can kind of build on what's already there. So if our services have been assessed by third-party assessors or even bodies like the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, they can build on that so they can focus on their landing zone. Again, I'll touch on that in a moment, but basically the basic guardrails they have, the tip of that pyramid, which is the focus of their whatever they're trying to do in the cloud, the building an application, supporting a service, offering whatever they are to their end users. At AWS and Amazon broadly, we've got a number of methods and processes we use to help continue to operate the organization as well as innovate. One of them is a concept we refer to as a mechanism. And so the idea behind this is it's a complete tool. So you create the tool, you drive the adoption of the tool, and then you inspect the results in order to make the relevant course corrections. And so through that process, you're going to validate that you have the right resources to provide the right inputs, if the correct stakeholders are involved, that you're making progress against your goals, and that you're delivering desired outcomes. So a mechanism can be applied to a small short-term effort, like a very quick urgent project, or even a more long-term multi-year project. If you go to the next slide. If you overlay that with the idea behind a security strategy, you can see it's kind of the same sort of mechanism there. So in the security world, there's a number of industry standard security frameworks, some of which I mentioned at the talking about the compliance frameworks, but there's things from ISO, NIST, Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, and these all contain the guidelines, standards, basically best practices for establishing and maintaining the relevant security controls to protect an organization. And you can leverage the one that fits best, whether you're regulated, like basically told to use a certain one, or whatever meets the needs of your organization best. And you can blend a few of them if you need to, and or even just tailor. So not all of a given standard may apply to your organization. But the general idea is that those things contain that list of here's what you should be doing. And the security strategy largely involves working through that, use that framework as a backstop. Here's what we should be doing. Here's what our target is based on that, and then iterating through that. Keep iterating through that that set of information, see where your organization stands against that profile, so you can identify whatever gaps there are, and based on those gaps, you can use that to make a plan and prioritize what do you need to close up first, and then work through the implementing and assessing to make sure that you're actually making progress against those goals. So it's not kind of a one-stop exercise. This is a living, breathing mechanism that you use to make sure your organization is where it needs to be. And then secondary to that is that mechanism helps you tell that story. So you're going to be trying to help others in your organization understand what you're doing security-wise. That might be up at the board of the directors. Hey, here's broadly what we're doing. Here's the help we need. We might need a bigger budget for these certain activities, people, tools, what have you, as well as people elsewhere in the organization, your peers. Hey, why is this so important? Why should they be helping you? As well as the people doing the day-to-day kind of in the mill, giving them the context of what they're doing and why it's important to the organization. So you go to the next slide. So now we'll kind of shift over to more of what I think you guys might be more interested in, some of the tools and services we have. So if you go to that next slide. So I mentioned we have somewhere north of 200 services. The subset you see on the slide here are those that are primarily geared towards security. And they're arranged around the common pillars of those security frameworks. Services to help you identify, to protect, detect, respond, recover. And so you can see that we've got services that support managing user access. So limit access to critical systems and data. So you can establish strong policies that determine what systems and data are available to who and under what conditions. We've got services to support network segmentation and protection so that only the necessary traffic is available. There's other services to help support your security incident detection and alerting, including leveraging some automation. And then in the event there is an event or an issue that needs to be looked into. There's services that available to support that investigation. And there's also on the recovery side, services to help support like not only recovering simple data backup, but more complex scenarios, but also to help define and test those recovery processes. Because it's not something you want to test the day of an incident. These are things you want to be working through, testing, be comfortable with, so that should something come up, you feel pretty confident that you can recover. So if you go to the next slide. So a lot of we get a lot of questions around, okay, that's great. You got these 200 magical pieces. How do we put these together? So if you go to the next slide, we have a number of different options to help our customers get there. And a lot of this is some of the work that our security teams do, as well as our um, various teams related to security to kind of help communicate how others can be secure with AWS. And the first is what we call our security reference architecture. So this is a kind of written down version. And this is a holistic set of guidelines for deploying the full complement AWS security services. It includes information and the recommended patterns for deploying, configuring, and operating an AWS environment securely, how to organize the different security services as well as your given accounts, as well as some guidance and examples on integrating different services in the most effective way. You go to the next slide. So taking that security reference architecture a step further, we have a resource we call a landing zone accelerator. And this helps organizations kind of simplify and accelerate their cloud journey by deploying, secure, compliant, scalable, automated solution that's aligned to their either regulatory or compliance requirements as needed. So I've mentioned the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity a couple of times. They offer a number of different, what they refer to as security profiles. So if you're going to hold some sensitive data, they've got a profile that says you should be doing these things to meet that. So for an organization that has a relatively limited security team, Landing Zone Accelerator is a great resource, but they can say, that's the standard we want to hit. This is a resource that can spin it up relatively quickly, so they can focus more time on operating the environment and deploying what their business objective is. So whatever application service they're trying to run, they can hurry up and get to that versus trying to recreate the wheel. So if you go to the next slide. This tries to highlight, if you take it back to that shared responsibility model. So the AWS is doing their side of things. On the cloud side of our customer side of responsibility, resources like that landing zone accelerator and other guidance helps close that gap on here are the things that you need to do in order to operate securely. So again, they can focus on their business objectives. So if you go next slide. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at a few of those security services, particularly around the detection and analysis side of things. And so I picked four, which are a combination of common as well as interesting. And these are ones that are typically used around threat detection, monitoring, and response, and basically help our customers with the visibility and otherwise just enhance their security posture. So again, you can think of these as if you're in an organization leveraging the cloud like AWS, these are tools that you could use to help improve your security program. And on the flip side, if you're more into the development side of things, these are the kind of services our security teams and engineers develop so that customers can help protect their environments. So if you go to the next slide. So start with kind of the common stages of an attack. So you have the initial reconnaissance for they're looking for potential misconfigurations or known vulnerabilities that they can exploit. Once they gain a foothold, they're going to try to escalate some privileges. And if they're able to do that, they're going to look around a little bit further. So additional reconnaissance, so looking for anything of value or at least trying to maintain some persistence. So if you go to the next slide. And this is exactly the type of activity our service we call guard duty is looking for. Basically activity that's not normal for your environment. So it's looking for things like unusual ports being used, changes in traffic volume, unexpected activity by users or resources. So Bill all of a sudden is using a service he's never used before. That seems to warrant looking into. So if you go to the next slide. So you can kind of see a depiction of what guard duty is doing here. So it combines machine learning, anomaly detection, network monitoring, malicious file discovery. And it leverages both intelligence that AWS has built from our operating of our giant network, millions of customers, but we also leverage third-party sources. So organizations like CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, we can leverage their intelligence to mix into that to try to help identify these non-normal activity. And then once a potential issue is found, a finding is going to be created, and there's going to be a severity to that finding. This is clearly something wrong. It's a high finding versus something low. This looks odd. It's up to you to decide if it's worth investigating. And so you can review those findings directly within the service itself, so guard duty, or you can have it sent to other services like Detective or Security Hub for further investigation. Or if your organization's already using another service like they have a SIM from Splunk or what have you, you can leverage some automation to have that sent over to that existing SIM, or even just leverage that automation to have some steps done before a human has to take a look. So if it's something like an unusual port, maybe you want to close that port before a human wants to take a look, or other steps like that. You go to the next slide. So I mentioned our service called Detective is one of those options. So there's a finding in guard duty, you can send it over to Detective. And so the way Detective works is once it's enabled, it automatically starts collecting data from the sources noted on there. So CloudShare logs, VPC, which is your virtual private cloud. It's like network traffic kind of things. And so Detective will take care of collecting that data, and then it's going to start to correlate that to identify any possible security events. And it primarily uses graph theory. And so it can automatically extract that time-based events like login attempts, API calls, network traffic from the sources I mentioned like CloudTrail and VPC, and then take that information from findings like from guard duty. If you go to the next slide, this kind of illustrates how Detective can lay that out in what we call a behavior graph. So you can see kind of a visual way how your resources are interacting and the behaviors happening there. So this effectively gives you just a nice general overall picture of your systems, your users, the various interactions among them. It allows you to perform some detailed analysis of specific activity, kind of help answer your questions of is this normal or within the realm of normal, or is this something that you need to look into further? And then you can correlate a lot of these collection of findings. So if you think of if you're operating AWS, one of our best practices is use multiple accounts, primarily for isolation. But if you have a guard duty finding in one account, that may be innocuous. But if you see that pattern across your accounts, that might be indicative of something more serious. So if you go to the next slide. And this gives you kind of more real world picture of what that graph looks like. Because, I mean, generally speaking, uncovering the root cause of a security findings, it can be very complex. Requires your analyst to collect a lot of logs, correlate the information across logs, determine the full scope of affected resources, often in a very stressful situation. And so this type of in-depth analysis needed because, again, if you're investigating individual security findings, you may kind of miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. And so having this behavior graph can kind of open you up to all the different activity going on that really highlights that pattern. And so Detective can help you analyze and visualize that various interaction with the logs. So you go to the next slide. So related to correlating all that information across logs, another service I wanted to highlight was one we call Security Lake. So kind of touched on it, but one of the common challenges for analyzing security data is just the volume of data, but typically that data is very inconsistent. It's usually incomplete. It's a lot of times it's very inefficient to access. You may need a specialized tool where this data is captured in a given tool, and they don't, it wasn't designed to allow that data to get out very easily. And so Security Lake is aimed to help address those kind of issues by normalizing the security log and the event data, by collecting and retaining and optimizing that data, so you can limit that need for that duplication or deduplication work or the various multiple steps that you need to translate that information into something a security team can use. And third, to also centralize that data visibility, provide the enterprise-wide insight so you can access that information and query it in minutes. And so one of the key elements behind that is what we call our open, not ours, but the open cybersecurity schema framework. And so this is an open source project that delivers simplified kind of vendor agnostic taxonomy for security data. So that can be adopted in any environment, application, or solution provider. So effectively a long-winded way of saying a standard format so that security practitioners can use that format in any system that they're utilizing. It doesn't have to be specifically AWS or another. And that standard helps speed up the data ingestion so you can kind of hurry up and get to analysis versus all the legwork that's needed to set the data up so you can actually take a look at it. So if you go to the next slide. So once you have that data, our server is called Amazon Athena. This is one of the options for analyzing that data in the security lake. So Athena is a serverless, it's an interactive analytics service. It's also built on an open source framework. So it supports open table and different file formats, but it's basically just a simplified, flexible way to analyze like petabytes worth of data. And it uses simple SQL query syntax. So you can do complex queries, joins across multiple data sources, and then you can dump the data down into CSV if you need to manipulate it further. If you go to the next slide. And I mentioned partners, is important. And you can see on this slide a subset of I think it's 145 participants in that open cybersecurity schema framework. And so this is a good example of how AWS works with partners. And I highlighted a few native AWS offerings, but we have this vast network of partners that customers can leverage. So if there's a product or service that they're familiar with, or they think it suits their requirements better, they can certainly leverage that. And if you go to the next slide, I think we're at the end. So you can use those QR codes to dive into more information about what I highlighted. There's resources like white papers, videos, articles, blog posts, training, and other documentation to kind of highlight security concepts, but also particularly how you can leverage AWS to improve some security. I think that's it.
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. We have a few questions here from our attendees. If you don't mind answering a couple of questions.
I'll give it a shot.
All right. How big of a security risk do mobile devices present in the modern age?
I mean, the word you hear basically from everybody with security in their title is going to be it depends. So it likely depends on the given use cases. I tend to be on the more optimistic side of things. So if the device, service, or tool helps you be more efficient or otherwise do your job better, I think there's likely a good way to secure it, even if it's mitigating factors. So it may not be 100% secure, but there's certainly steps you put in the way that should signal that something's going on before something bad happens.
Okay. Second question is, do cloud services also create cybersecurity risks?
Uh, I wouldn't tie it one to one. I think operating anything that's kind of on the internet creates a potential cybersecurity risk. So I think it's better. I prefer focusing on there is a wealth of information out there around what to do, and certainly resources AWS or other cloud service providers offer to kind of help narrow down what that risk might be. So I don't think they inherently create more risk. I mean, going back to I'm old enough that I've kind of was working pre-cloud days as well. So I had the same challenges there, working in financial service companies that offer, banking-like services to the such. We had the same challenges in on-premise or how we were doing things then as we do in the cloud. I've personally found how I can do my security jobs more efficiently and more easier in the cloud because I don't have to do some of that shared responsibility model where you kind of have the choice of what you want to focus on. I can focus more on my security tasks than worrying about patching or trying to find the one person or two people within the company that can give me access to a certain device in the data center kind of thing. So I find it much more efficient.
Okay, great. And are two-factor authentications enough to keep security attacks at bay?
Uh, Again, it depends. I wouldn't say that in and of itself. It's certainly, I would highly recommend two-factor on everything. It's definitely proven to be a deterrent. So, I mean, broadly thinking, if you can think of what makes you a harder target than something else, two-factor is an easy way to start. So, 100% would encourage it.
All right, perfect. And fourth question is, what readings can you suggest for coding and syntax knowledge?
Um, Again, it kind of depends on what you're going to do. I mean, I heard Python highlight before. I mean, in my world, with a lot of security services, where the coding comes into play is where you're kind of stitching things together. So whether you're taking data from one place to another, or you're helping with some automation that you need to logically execute a few steps. So being familiar with one or two, I would highlight is very helpful. But there's certainly tools that are making this a lot easier. I know on the AWS side, we have a service called Code Whisper, which incorporates some of the generative AI in it that makes it so much easier to code. I'm not a master coder myself. I know enough to be dangerous, but things like Code Whisper just making my life that much easier because I don't have to Google or search or ask for how do you guys do this kind of thing. It's kind of it's already ahead of me. So I would definitely take a look at looking at JavaScript, Python, play with those a little bit. If you kind of get the sense of how the logic goes together, I think you'll be able to apply to any other language that you might have to use given the environment you're in.
Perfect. And one final question, what are a few advantages that Amazon Web Services has over Microsoft Azure?
Uh, I mean, I guess there's a few. I mean, we've been in the game the longest, so there's certainly some resiliency to our environment, the breadth and depth, and it's where I would also encourage you to understand the terminology they use to describe regions versus how we do it as well. There's some differences in all that. I would obviously favor the way AWS is doing it. Number of services. I also think we're that much more agnostic to. I think at one point it's probably shifted now, but at one point there were more Windows servers running in AWS than in Azure. So we're kind of happy to help you accomplish whatever your goals are. We don't necessarily care what you use to get there. We prefer that you do it securely, but whatever makes it easier for you to accomplish your mission, we're there to support it.
Perfect. So there is one last question. I did say last, but it just came in. We
Like
want to
three
answer
times.
as
Yeah.
many. I promise it's the last one.
All right.
What certificates do you recommend for an entry position in cybersecurity? Entry level position in cybersecurity.
I mean, entry level. I mean, I would say there's a hard and true one. Some of the certs require a certain amount of time in a given role before you earn the cert. Even if you pass the test, you have to have like a year or two, that kind of thing. So I would focus more on what are the aspects that you want to understand better to apply to the job. So is it penetration testing, or is it, security strategy, a broader one, or are you more interested in the audit side of things? So I would use the more of what it helps you do than whether a certain cert's gonna to get you in. Because in my experience, a lot of security roles I've came up through, security teams tend to be made up of people that can just kind of figure things out. So showing that you're adaptable, you can pick up whether it's coding languages, you're able to finish projects, those kind of things, showing that you're capable of following through on different things. That's going to be ideal. So entry level, it's very hard to, obviously you don't have a huge background, but once you get in, you can just start showing that you can do a lot of different things. You're flexible. There's no like kind of robot that does this. So you kind of have to have that human factor.
Perfect. Okay, that is it. So again, on behalf of CDI College and our attendees, thank you again, Bill, for this great presentation and
Thank you for
the
having me.
insight you've given us. Thank you.
You're welcome.